This video is about replacing a parquet floor in the dining area of a great room in my house with a product from Lumber Liquidators called Lisbon Cork flooring. Now, before I started, I took a trip down to Harbor Freight and put one of these multi-function oscillating tools, figuring that might help me a little bit getting the old parquet up. And it looks like it's a pretty well-made tool, and it even comes with an extra set of brushes, so we'll see how that works out. It turned out that the biggest part of the job was going to be removing the old parquet flooring. Originally, I thought that it would just pop right up, seeing how it was glued down years ago, but it turned out to be a different story. So I started with a hammer and chisel, trying to just loosen up areas that I could, and went along a little bit at a time, kind of prying the old flooring out. After getting a couple pieces up, I decided to try the little oscillating tool and see if that would get under it and help get it up, but it turned out that really it was basically useless for anything other than just kind of removing the old splinters and the old layer of glue that was left on the subflooring. So over a matter of about 3 days that it took me to remove the entire floor, I had quite the mess. It turned out that the existing glue had bonded the tiles to the floor so well that it wound up ripping out lots of chunks of the top of the old subflooring, which turned out to be a mess that I didn't expect. And we only have a 8-foot ceiling in the room, so I really did not want to raise this floor another 3/8 inch and leave the old parquet down. So this is kind of the mess that I wound up dealing with. And once I got all the old tiles up, as you can see, there was really just basically a mess left of splinters sticking up and large slivers that had to be cut out, and piles of ridges of glue all over the place. So this is where that little Harbor Freight tool really came in handy. I ran that for probably a good 8-10 hours straight without any problems with it. It didn't even overheat, and it was nice that you could adjust the speed on it so that it did not vibrate your hands very bad. All in all, it turned into quite the mess that I had never expected when I first started this job. But anyhow, after removing all the splinters, I went back and I took the little vibrating tool to remove the edge moldings that go into the old bamboo floorings, and that worked pretty good just for getting under the edges and breaking the glue so things could be removed without damaging any parts. And after getting everything cleaned up, I realized that the floor was just too rough to put down the underlayment that I had purchased, which is only about a 0.2 inch or 0.22 inch thick product. So I went off to Home Depot and got a product that was called like a floor leveling compound. It's like a concrete-based product that's made for leveling subfloors before you put down the finished floor. So I took the entire floor and all the bad spots. I put a nice coat of this on to level it up and get it ready for to get the underlayment to have enough good substrate underneath supporting it properly. And applying this leveler and having to wait overnight for the stuff to dry really just turned into another days that was going to stretch out the project that I did not originally plan for. But in the end, it did give me a fairly smooth level surface to start putting the underlayment down. Now that all the mess is basically out of the way, now comes the easy part of the job, and that is basically I put a layer of a underlayment grade substrate on the floor. And it's funny how I purchased it at Home Depot that the sticker on it said that they had shipped it from China. It was made and shipped from China. I can't believe that it pays to ship something like that from abroad. The underlayment went down real easy, and basically I just took and I fastened it down with some quarter inch crown staples using a air powered staple gun. and it allowed me to kind of countersink the head slightly below the surface also, so there'd be no protrusions when I was done. Now, with all the subflooring down, the next step was to apply a product that's called a feather finish that will go back and it will fill up all the little pockets left by the staples. It actually fills in all the seams and gaps in the plywood. It kind of levels everything out to give you a real smooth finish before applying the cork tiles. That product was a real easy product to apply. I just used a big concrete finishing trowel to try to get everything, keep everything nice and smooth and level, and then it just had to sit and dry for a couple of hours before going on. Now, I had purchased this cork flooring several years before, and I got a big surprise when I opened up the boxes. It turned out that none of the tiles were actually cut square or parallel on all the sides. They were all kind of shifted. It seems like whatever machine they used to cut them for the final production did not do a good job at it. So it was off to my table saw to trim all the tiles up. I wound up taking about 1/4 of an inch off of the width of each tile by the time I was done to get 2 straight and parallel sides. And then I wound up taking another 1/2 inch off the length of the tile just to keep the ratio 2:1 on. They wound up cutting really nice on my table, so I just had to put a piece of 1/4 inch plywood down and plunge the blade through it to give me a zero clearance table to work on. And first I went through and I trimmed all the edges straight on one side. I used a piece of aluminum extrusion to span any warpage that there was in the tiles. As you can see, they're kind of bowed on some of them too. So I used a long straight edge, and that helped me get one straight side on the tile. Then I just went back and I flipped them all around and I straightened up the other side and made everything parallel. I guess after all that I went through with these tiles and trying to square them up and whatnot, I would not recommend this flooring to from Lumber Liquidators to anyone. As you can see, I had quite a stack of tiles that I had to go through and modify. And once you do one, you have to bring them all into the same size to make the floor work out. After getting 2 parallel sides on it, I just set up my sliding table on my saw with a another piece of 1/4 inch plywood to give me a zero clearance insert so that the cork would not chip out when cutting it. And I proceeded to cut one end of the tiles square to the 2 edges that I had already trimmed. Then it was just a matter of putting a stop block on the fence and taking all the tiles and going through and flipping them end for end and cutting the other side to be square and to be the same size as the rest of the tiles. I must say this is about 4 hours that I wound up wasting due to poor quality of these tiles. Now it was time to lay the tiles, finally. Well, I started by just snapping a chalk line straight down the center of the room where I wanted to start my tiles from, and decided that I would work the room in 2 halves. I'd do one half first, and then I'd flip over to the other side, do the other half next. So I started basically by going through and just spreading enough cement to do a tile or 2 at a time, and then laying the tile down and taking a Formica J roller, I guess they call it, that I had. It's just basically a rubber roller with a aluminum handle on it. And I took and I put all the weight of my body that I could on it to roll everything down flat and get any bumps or lumps of glue or anything else out from under them. Now with the first half done, I just basically let that sit overnight, and then I went back and I did the exact same thing with the other half of the room. One thing that I really had never noticed so before was that some of the tiles were different thicknesses, so that does present a little bit of a problem, but basically they came out pretty nice looking. And after letting them sit overnight for the glue to dry, I went back the next day and I just did a light sanding on the sealer coat that they have applied to the tiles. And I just sanded them back and tried to get everything as smooth as I could. It turned out that all the tiles laid perfectly flat at the same height. So there were a little bit of variations in some seams that you can visibly see, but they turned out pretty good. Then it was just a matter of going back through and putting on 4 coats of polyurethane. The polyurethane went on really easy. It was a water-based finish that I had to use on them. And I just got one of those lamb's wool mops, I guess they call it, and put it on a stick for a handle and just kind of spread it out and poured a little bit on and then spread it out with the mop. And it went really easy. It only took about 15 minutes for the coat. Yeah, the finish that I chose was a clear satin finish. And it turned out that when it goes on, it's basically a cloudy, milky color to start out with. And as it dries, that color slowly disappears and it turns into a nice, clear finish. Now, with the first coat on, basically, it was just a matter of waiting. I waited about 2 hours for it to dry before going back and starting a second coat. Now, before starting the second coat, I did notice that actually there seemed to be some swelling at the edges of the tiles. That it's probably caused because when I went back and I trimmed the tiles because they were out of square, they all had a sealer on them from the factory. And it seems that I must have cut that sealer off, and then it allows the tiles to soak some of the polyurethane in from the edge and swell slightly. After the second coat, I let the floor dry overnight, and then I had to go back and do a final sanding on the floor in the poly. I tried to knock off some of the higher edges on the seams wherever they had swollen and whatnot, and it came out pretty good when I was done sanding. Then it was just a matter of going back and now applying a third coat of poly, which really was starting to bring the floor really nice, flush, level, and bring out some shine on it. And that stuff still goes on pretty milky looking, but it does dry really nice and clear. So let's see, after this third coat, I just had to let it dry for another 2 hours before going on and then doing a final coat of the poly, which it said you could put 6 or 7 coats on if you wanted, but I decided to stop at 4 because everything started looking pretty good, and I was afraid I might start getting a hazy finish if I went with much more. Now the last coat, it went on real quick, and it didn't seem to take as much poly as the rest of them. I had bought a gallon for the floor, and it turned out that I still had plenty left to do several more coats in the future. But after letting the floor sit for about 7 days to cure, then I was able to move all of the furniture back in the room and start using the floor. The only thing missing are a couple pieces of trim now that have to be done, but basically with all the problems that I had, it did come out pretty good, and I'm happy with the overall results. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.